Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're jumping right into the absolute biggest questions of human existence. Based on our source text, we are objectively mapping out a really fascinating debate between two fundamentally opposing worldviews, naturalistic atheism and classical Islamic theism. We're going to dig into the math, the biology, and the profound philosophical conclusions each side offers about why we are actually here.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll be hitting evidence and the unseen, the cosmic origin conundrum, biological complexity and probability, the problem of evil, and wrapping up with nihilism versus ultimate purpose. Let's get right into it. Starting with Section 1, Evidence and the Unseen. This is basically the epistemological divide, how each of these paradigms actually measures truth and defines reality. Our source text kicks things off by looking at the atheistic reliance on scientism. This is the idea that the empirical scientific method is literally the only valid pathway to knowledge. Within this framework, if you can't prove a creator in a laboratory setting, well, it just doesn't count. In fact, we often see this argument comparing a belief in God to believing in mythological constructs. The implication is that if you can't physically measure it, believing in it is kind of no different than believing in the tooth fairy. But here's where the Islamic perspective pushes back. And it's a really interesting counter. The source outlines how demanding physical proof for a non-physical creator is actually a massive category error. See, mythological creatures are supposed to be physical entities hiding somewhere inside the universe. But classical theism defines God as entirely transcendent, existing completely outside of space, time, and matter. The text uses this great analogy. Demanding physical evidence for God is basically like dissecting a car's engine in a futile attempt to physically locate the engineer who designed it. Moving right along to Section 2, the cosmic origin conundrum. We're tackling that fiercely debated question. Why is there something rather than absolutely nothing? First, we have to get our definitions straight regarding true philosophical nothingness, because there's a lot of semantic confusion here. When theoretical physicists claim the universe came from nothing, well, actually, the source points out they are usually referring to a highly structured quantum vacuum that obeys complex physical laws. But that just begs the question, where did those quantum laws come from? True philosophical nothingness has zero properties, absolutely zero causal power. To break this down, the text points to a really elegant deductive argument found in Surah At-Tur of the Quran. It basically approaches this by logically eliminating impossible origins for our finite universe. Option 1, absolute nothingness, impossible, because 0 plus 0 is 0. Option 2, self-creation, that's a logical paradox. You can't exist before you exist to create yourself. Option 3, an infinite regress of causes. Mathematically impossible, because you'd never actually arrive at the present moment. According to the source, systematically crossing these out leaves exactly one logical conclusion. The universe was created by something eternal and uncreated. Now, you might be thinking of that famous atheistic counterargument. Okay, if God created the universe, who created God? The source uses the Kalam Cosmological Argument to categorize this objection as a straight-up fallacy. Notice the specific wording here. Causality only applies to things that begin to exist. Because the prime mover is, by definition, eternal and outside of time, he never began to exist. From this perspective, asking who created an uncreated being is a category error. It's akin to asking, hey, what does the color red taste like? Let's transition over to our third area of inquiry, biological complexity and probability. Is life just a blind accident, or is it the result of profound teleology, which is the study of purpose and design? The core teleological argument here compares simple manufactured objects to biological complexity. Think about a basic needle and thread binding materials together and compare that to RNA binding amino acids in your cells, or a computer processing data, mirrored by the unimaginably complex human brain. The source highlights a perceived contradiction in the materialist worldview. If simple manufactured items undeniably necessitate an intelligent engineer, it is logically inconsistent to claim their vastly superior biological equivalents just assemble themselves by accident. To be totally impartial, we have to look at the atheistic poor design argument, also known as dysteleology. This perspective asks a very fair question. If we are designed, why do we have choking hazards from shared windpipes, or incredibly painful wisdom teeth, or degenerative diseases? Atheism points to these vulnerabilities as the literal hallmarks of blind, unguided evolutionary patching, rather than the work of a perfect divine engineer. But the source outlines a fascinating Islamic rebuttal to that exact objection. It argues that the atheist premise makes a massive assumption. It assumes God intended to build an indestructible vessel for a utopian earthly life. But as we see highlighted in Islamic theology, The earthly body was deliberately designed to be a fragile, mortal, biodegradable vessel meant for a temporary spiritual test. In this view, critiquing the human body for being susceptible to decay is literally like critiquing a disposable cup for eventually breaking down. It was designed to be temporary.
Okay, get ready for some staggering math. This massive number, 10 to the 150th power, is known as the universal probability bound. Formulated by mathematicians, it factors in all the particles in the universe, the fastest possible rate of physical transitions, and the entire age of the cosmos. It represents the absolute maximum limit of physical events that could have ever occurred in the entire history of our universe.
To put that boundary into perspective, to get just one minimally functional protein by blind chance, the odds are 1 in 10 to the 164th power. To get a single living cell, that's 1 in 10 to the 40,000th power. Because these required probabilities vastly exceed that universal probability bound we just talked about, the source argues that relying on blind chance and infinite time mathematically collapses. There literally hasn't been enough time or matter in the universe to generate these structures by luck alone. We now tackle Section 4, the problem of evil. This is perhaps the most emotionally resonant existential question in this entire explainer. Why is there suffering? When presenting the atheistic Epicurean paradox, which essentially argues that an all-loving God wouldn't allow suffering, the text points out an underlying philosophical dilemma. In a strict naturalist worldview, there is no objective good or evil. It's just matter in motion and the brutal survival of the fittest. A virus terminating a host isn't evil in biology. It's just doing its programming. Therefore, the source argues that for an atheist to be outraged by injustice, they're unknowingly relying on an objective moral standard, which logically points right back to a transcendent moral lawgiver. Islamic theology reframes this paradigm entirely. While atheism often views God through a really strict binary of power and love, Islam emphasizes God as al-Hakim, meaning the all-wise. The text notes that removing all suffering and hardship from the world would mandate removing human free will. Think about it. Without the capacity to choose evil or experience hardship, the capacity to show profound compassion, moral fortitude, and patience would become totally meaningless. In this framework, the suffering doesn't negate God. It is the exact mechanism that validates the earthly test. For our fifth and final section, nihilism versus ultimate purpose, let's examine the ultimate destiny of humanity according to both worldviews. Where is this all going? The source notes that the logical culmination of the atheistic worldview is existential nihilism. Within a strictly materialist framework, humanity comes from nothing and goes to nothing. Even if we create localized, subjective meaning in our daily lives, like focusing on a career or our family, the ultimate truth of this paradigm is that those are just cosmic illusions. They're destined to be permanently erased by the eventual heat death of the universe. Conversely, Islamic theology completely dismantles that nihilistic view. It posits that humanity is the absolute zenith of physical creation, endowed with intellect and free will for a highly specific reason. The argument here is simple. If every microscopic part of biology has a functional purpose, it totally defies logic that the human being as a whole is somehow purposeless. In this view, every single conscious, just action serves a deliberate, grand purpose when aligned with the Creator. So, we are ultimately left with two entirely different definitions of reality. On one hand, a return to absolute nothingness, the terrifying ultimate obliteration of human consciousness. On the other, the Islamic paradigm views death not as a final end, but as a transitional threshold. It's viewed simply as the bell ringing at the end of an earthly exam, leading to a purposeful, glorious return to eternal life. To conclude our explainer today, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought. Looking at the entirety of what the source material mapped out for us, the math, the biology, the logic of origins, ask yourself this. Does the evidence point to humanity emerging from nothing, for absolutely nothing? Or are we the intentional creations of an all-wise architect? It really is the ultimate question of existence, and how you answer it changes absolutely everything. Thanks for joining this explainer, and keep seeking the truth.